Yeah.
Hello, PAX. All right.
Whoa.
If you were here last hour, you saw the creative minds that brought the world of Kaladesh to life, and now we're going to get to talk to the people who brought the gameplay aspects of the set to life. So, before we get into the mechanics of Kaladesh, some introductions. First, we have Ian Duke here in the center, senior game designer. He co-led the final design, otherwise known as development of the set, and you may recognize Ian from his work on our Pro Tour coverage. Next, we have Ben Hayes. Ben is a senior game designer as well. He was on both the initial and final design teams for Kaladesh, so he saw this thing from beginning to end, and he was also the lead developer for the small set Ether Revolt that will be following this set. Next, Liz Leo. Liz has since moved on from Wizards of the Coast, but for Kaladesh, she was our graphic designer, and you'll see that this set had some really difficult graphic design challenges to solve for, above and beyond what most other sets do, and Liz did a lot to make the set awesome. Sean Main, senior game designer. He was the co-lead of the initial design of the set, and also you may know Sean as the lead designer of Conspiracy Take the Crown, which is the last thing you guys should have enjoyed. And finally, who does not know Mark Rosewater? Magic's head designer and social media maven. He co-led the initial design team, and which marked his 20th set design lead. And so I'm going to hand it over to Mark to start the conversation with where did Kaladesh come from?
So Kaladesh had an interesting throw forward. We originally introduced it in Magic Origins. And so normally when we look at worlds, brand new worlds, for example, we start from scratch, but that wasn't true here. This was a world where we had a template to start from. Sean, actually, you led Magic Origins.
So we had a preview that the art team had started working on things. So you normally begin with such a blank slate, but this time we had visuals and we had the little bit of design that had gone into it, and so we Origins got to hint at everything we were going to do here.
So one of the big things we wanted to do is we wanted to capture the feel of Kaladesh. I talked about this in the opening show. It was a world that was optimistic, it was bright, it was a world of invention, and it was a world of technology, and that was a really important point, that we wanted to make sure to differentiate what we were doing here from Mirrodin. That's the last time we really done an artifact block, and in Mirrodin, the metal was part of the creatures. It was part of the biology of the creatures. But here, it wasn't, the creatures weren't made of metal. They used, the technology was something they used. And so we stressed from early on that in this world, the artifacts were technology, not biology. And there are three mechanics which we're going to talk about today. Energy, vehicles, and fabricate.
And we're going to walk through each one individually, and for each one, Sean is going to start with the beginnings of the design of the mechanics. So Sean, tell us about energy.
So let's bring up the card you might have seen this morning. This is Etherworks Marvel, and it says every time a permanent you control is put into a graveyard, you get 1 energy. And that's what that little symbol represents. And energy is not like mana. It's a new resource to the game, and it's a type of counter that you get as the player. On its own, it isn't going to do anything, but each time, each of the cards that gives you some way of spending energy, and most of them that get energy, will give you something to do with that energy. And a lot of the fun is, as you put together different energy cards, you can kind of mix and match them, and some of the energy from this card you'll spend over here, or as you get more energy cards, you'll just get more options for how you're able to use things.
Okay, so we're talking about the origin. So let's go back to the very beginning of the energy mechanic, aka Mechanic E. So I originally created this mechanic in Mirrodin 14 years ago. I really wanted to do an artifact block. I fought really hard for us to do it. Invasion had been multicolor, Odyssey had been the graveyard, Onslaught had been a tribal block, and I really wanted to do an artifact block, and I argued vociferously to let me do one, and they finally said yes, and they put me in charge of it. So the goal was how to make awesome artifacts. So what I did was I went back and I looked at all the cool artifacts that had been made, and this card sort of struck my fancy. I will call this the best card in Homelands. The thing that fascinated me about this card was I loved the idea that you only got 3 arrows. I know the art shows more, but you only got 3 arrows. And I really liked the idea that you had to choose when to use them. You know, it was a resource that you had to use. And so I was very fascinated by this. So what I did was I put cards in my set that did this, the cards that only had so many uses to them. And so I really was fascinated by this, and I loved the idea that, oh, the different artifacts had different uses to them. Then one day I made one card that was a special card that said you could use counters from anywhere, not just from itself. And I liked it. So I said, let's do that. Let's try to make this mechanic. And so here's some cards from Bacon, which was the code name for Mirrodin. So we actually executed it. We actually made it. I put it in the set, and I was really excited. I really liked energy. One of the problems with young designers is they tend to put a lot in the set, and I was so excited to do an artifact. I just put so many mechanics in, and Bill Rose, who was the head designer at the time, now our VP, said to me, he goes, Mark, I love what you've done. You've just done too much, and we got to take something out. And the problem with energy was it took a lot of space. It was really, it didn't interconnect with the other things of the set quite as much as other things did, and so we had to pull it. And so we actually pulled it from the set. But I vowed that one day, Mechanic E would come back, energy would come back, and that day would be Shards of Alara. Shards of Alara had Esper, which was one of the 5 shards. It had an artifact theme to it. It was a world in which they were constantly improving themselves, and it really felt like, oh, energy could work here. It thematically made sense. The problem I had was it was only 1/5 of the set, and it wasn't the kind of mechanic that you shoehorn in 1/5 of the set. It really needed more room to breathe. It really didn't feel balanced with the other mechanics, and so in the end, it didn't work out for Shards of Alara. So, no Shards of Alara. But I vowed that one day we would find a home for it. And so, on the very first meeting of the exploratory, not even design, of exploratory design, which Sean ran, I said to them on the first meeting, I go, guys, let's see if we can make energy work. So Sean's going to talk a little bit about what we did in that first few meetings.
So this is a whiteboard from one of those first early meetings, and if I ever thought that thousands of people would be looking at it, maybe I would have tried to write a little bit neater.
Get your screenshots now.
So we knew we wanted to do energy. We had the overall idea, and we had a couple directions. And often, like with the mechanic, you really want to push early on how it might work. So you want to try pulling it this way. What if you do this with it?
Well, one quick thing. I didn't tell them what we did in Mirrodin. I just gave them the premise for the mechanic, and I wanted to see what they were going to do with it. So I didn't tell them how we executed it. That's really important.
Yeah, so, I mean, we really pushed a couple different versions of it, and we played with it, and we really ran them through the gamut. So this is after we'd done the initial play testing, and these were 3 different versions that we tried. Energy there, on the left is the one that would eventually become the final version. Charge counters were a little bit more like you saw in Mirrodin. You'd get counters on individual cards, and kind of like Mark was describing before, where you could spend them between different things. And I should also point out on the top row there is the pros that each of these mechanics had as we finally sat down, and on the bottom were the negatives. And gizmos were kind of blank artifacts that some creatures might come with scrap metal, essentially, that you could spend and sacrifice on different things. So we had these couple different versions that we were playing with, and really energy was the clear winner. Charge counters were interesting, but they were very fiddly, that I couldn't look across the table and see how much energy did you have. Spending it, you'd really want to like spread out your spend across different cards, so it was very confusing. And gizmos just had really kind of bad flavor, that this ether punk aesthetic was just such beautiful artisanal artifacts, and it wasn't that like dirty scrap heap or something. So energy had a couple issues which we can address, but overall it was the big winner from these.
Yeah, one of the things that's really important when we're making mechanics is we want you to spend your mental energy on where the fun of the mechanic is. And for example, the charge counters, the problem was there was all this maintenance. Because if someone destroyed an artifact that had charge counters on it, you lost those charge counters. So there's this game of spreading them out. Like it required you to do a lot of mental gymnastics that didn't really pay off. And that what energy was nice is, look, you got the counters, it was a number, you could track the number, and it just was the cleanest, easiest version. Now the interesting thing was, that's exactly what we chose to do in Mirrodin. I didn't tell them this, but they came to the exact same conclusion of how to execute it. And so, here's some cards from early playtests.
So before you saw some of the playtest cards, like what most of our day looks like, this is really at the very beginning of the process where we're just quickly writing them. And again, I apologize for my handwriting. But this is really like the start of what got us down the path. We were experimenting with various things that come with energy, or maybe they would have like one card there, you'd sacrifice creatures to get it. And this was just us experimenting on the range of what it could do.
So if you looked at the last, we talked about pros and cons. The big con of energy was parasitism, which meant that, like, if you needed energy, well, only these things provided energy. And so one of the goals was, how do we solve that? How do we make sure that energy doesn't just require a deck of nothing but energy? So how do we do that?
So there are a couple ways that we came at that. The first one is every card that requires you to spend energy also has a way of generating it. So it's
almost all.
Thank you. So that they're self-contained, so that you always get at least, almost always, get at least one use out of it. And the other way is that, and these guys can probably talk about that much better, we wanted the economy to be such that not everything required one energy, so that you really could mix and match and things would be about worth the same. And we had a little bit of cards. I mean, this hacker nexus up there did not become a final card, but things like this that you could kind of slot into a deck that you already had, and it would generate energy on its own such that you had a self-contained package.
Right. Well, one of our goals was we wanted you to be able to play one energy card. We wanted you to play a deck full of energy. We want that all of that could work. And so the key to that, though, is how exactly do we make it work? So Ben's going to handle this next part.
Sure. So as Aaron mentioned, I was on both the initial design team and the final design or development team. And as the person on that early team who was most focused on game balance, we've got this really cool idea, this really cool mechanic. We also have all the goals of the set. If you were watching earlier, you would have heard Mark talk about variants of gameplay, where you can play with the same deck over and over again and have different outcomes and different experiences. Energy was great for that, but at the end of the day, we do have to make a bunch of cards, and so early on, we really figured out that, it was really sort of on me to proof of concept that this was going to work, that if you had different energy gains and different energy spends, that people would spend the energy on one card or another card. There were a lot of challenges along the way. Variations where you would stockpile all your energy and then spend it all on one thing, or just the execution sort of was important to achieving the goal with this really cool idea, this really cool mechanic. So we came up with this energy economy of sort of baseline types of effects, different types of effects that would cost different amounts of energy, or effects similar to those, so that you sort of never felt bad about spending your energy. And there were also a lot of other things that we had to solve as we went further along in the process and the development of the mechanic, and as we transitioned into development, which Ian led. I'll let him tell you more about those things.
So note that a 1/1 flyer is 1.5 times as expensive as a 1/1 counter. So we're going to get back to that later, actually.
That's a great note. Very precise as well, Aaron. So hey, everyone. I'm Ian Duke. I was a lead developer on the set here. And so for those of you not super familiar with our process, development's sort of the second half of the design process. My job as a developer is to execute as well as possible on sort of the vision for the set, make sure the mechanics are working right, the set's playing well, things are balanced, all that sort of stuff. And I think development sort of has the reputation that we are very focused on high-level tournament play and making things very balanced for like the Pro Tour, for example. And that's true, that is an important part of what we do, but it's only a very small part of what we do. Really, we're focused on making sure that Magic plays well at all levels of play and that the gameplay is as enjoyable as possible. And so when we were thinking about energy, this was a huge challenge for us because energy is unlike anything we've ever done in Magic before. It's this brand new resource. It's kind of like mana in that you spend it on things. It's kind of like cards in hand because it doesn't replenish automatically in the way that mana does every turn, and you can run out of it over time. But it was this unique thing all to its own. And so we kind of went in without a baseline of what to compare it to. And so the first thing we did was we jumped in and we play tested with the mechanic, and we saw how it was playing and what people were enjoying about it. And what we were really looking for were what were like the fun designs, the fun nuggets of the mechanic that we kind of latch onto. And we used that to form the basis of our energy economy that Ben was talking about. And so one of the kind of baseline effects that we found people were having a really good time with was just putting +1/+1 counters on creatures. So we actually had a cycle of creatures at common that can spend energy to put +1/+1 counters on them. And so when we recognized that as like a basic fun thing to do with energy, the first thing we tried was having 1 energy equate to 1 +1/+1 counter. Now what we found after doing that is that there were effects that were a little bit smaller than a +1/+1 counter, or kind of like in between on that spectrum of the costs there, as you saw on the previous. And so at one point in our development process, we actually just kind of inflated our energy economy. We doubled everything, right? So we made 1 +1/+1 counter equal 2 energy. And what that let us do was have effects that were a little bit smaller than that, and effects that were larger, and effects that were in between. It gave us a little bit more granularity in that game balance. And the reason that's so important, the reason we have this whole energy economy here and all of that, is to make sure that you could feel like you could spend your energy on whatever you wanted to do in the game. It wasn't about accumulating a bunch of energy and then finding the best thing to spend it on and just dumping your energy all at once for the same effect. We wanted to create variety in gameplay so that you, as the player, you were the inventor and you could make the choice about what you wanted to spend your energy on from game to game, and that would vary depending on the game state. And once we made this change and we kind of lined everything up along with this energy economy here, we found that people were doing that. It was a major change in the gameplay there. Instead of saving everything up and feeling like you were stupid for spending your energy, people were actually making the choices they wanted and really enjoying that a lot. So it was a huge improvement there. And I just want to emphasize that these examples here, they're just examples. This is not everything you can do with the energy in the set. In fact, I'm not even sure if these are exactly all things that you can do with energy in the set. They're just example baselines that we could compare other effects to and give you a variety of things and make sure that they were roughly balanced there. Also, it's worth mentioning, there are some effects that actually scale even beyond this. And as you go up in energy costs, it's kind of, it's like a nonlinear scaling. The more you spend at once, the more you get per energy you spend. And there are actually some pretty awesome effects where you're spending like 6 or 8 energy at a time to get some pretty cool things.
What's the biggest?
I think 8 is the most energy you can spend at once, and you can get some pretty awesome stuff. The next thing we were thinking about, once we got things in line for kind of the basic nuts and bolts of energy, is we were thinking about how do we want energy to play a role in Constructed. So we wanted to make sure that energy would slot into basic Magic strategies that people already liked to build decks around. So if you wanted to build an aggressive deck, like a red-green aggro deck with some big green creatures and some burn spells, that there would be energy cards to put into those decks. And we wanted to make sure if you're like a control player who likes to draw a bunch of cards and kill creatures and prolong the game and win an excruciatingly long game where you're kind of locking down your opponent, that we give you some cards for that too. They're very fun. And so we created these like energy packages of a couple cards, 3 or 4 cards that would go in different decks, and we made sure they were very self-sufficient, so you didn't feel like you had to play a ton of energy in your deck to make it work. You could just play like, say 8 or 12 energy cards, or even less than that, and that they would make sense on their own and be strong cards. So you'll see some of those as we go through the preview season. That said, if you really enjoy energy and it appeals to you, we also made sure that you can build the all-energy deck and just kind of generate tons and tons of energy and do awesome things with it, because after all, that's what Kaladesh is about, doing awesome things. And so the final thing we were thinking about as we were playtesting energy is we wanted to make sure people understood it and could play with it well. And a big part of that was making sure that the cards read well and they were visible and you could understand what they were doing there. And so I worked with Liz Leo, who is our graphic designer for Kaladesh, on what energy actually looked like on the cards, and she'll tell you guys more about that.
Hi, so obviously all mechanics do not get symbols, but this was a new resource that we wanted to be visually impactful on the card. So after deciding we wanted to make a symbol, one of the next challenges we faced was what did we want the symbol to look like? And as you know, energy is an intangible thing, much like colorless mana, which I worked on the symbol for that. What is that? It's sort of, literally in the ether. So first off, we decided that we didn't want the symbol to be connected directly to Kaladesh. So after that, it became pretty obvious that I wasn't going to make players learn a new mechanic along with a new symbol. So we went with something that most people already know, which is the lightning bolt to symbolize energy. So much like their whiteboard drawings, we have some of the early versions of the symbols I worked on, not really meant to see the light of day, but you can see I just started with the lightning bolt. And the thing about lightning to me is that it's light, and we knew we were going to be printing in black ink, so I wanted the lightning part to be in the negative space surrounded by black. I had an idea where the lightning bolt was breaking apart this five-sided shape, and five-sided shapes have meaning in Magic because energy is something that's separate from all of the 5 colors. And eventually I got to this shape that looks almost diamond-like, and it didn't really speak true to me because, as you've seen from the images, the preview, there is not a single straight line in Kaladesh. And so even though this wasn't directly tied to Kaladesh, I wanted to make the symbol fit in and feel at home there. So I made all the lines curved with the same curve to, I think, give it a little more of a sort of human feel. And once the symbol was designed, the last thing we sort of had to figure out was how we were going to template it on the card.
What's interesting to me is that you avoided a round symbol.
I avoided a round symbol specifically because we didn't want it to look like a mana symbol. I think it was important that it read as something completely different because it isn't a mana symbol. As mentioned, it doesn't refresh each turn. It sticks around. And so once we had the symbol ready, deciding how to template it was another challenge. We decided against just the word 1 and energy symbol, or the word 3 in an energy symbol. And we thought that it would make more sense to show 8 energy symbols if there was going to be a symbol that was a card that was requiring 8 energy symbols, because then you would know if you're drafting cards that are producing lots of energy that that's a card for you instantly visually, and if you weren't, then that probably wasn't a card that you should pick up. And speaking of lots of energy symbols,
so once we tried this approach of stacking together a bunch of energy symbols all together, we found it had this really cool visceral feel where you just saw a card and immediately popped here, wow, I can spend a ton of energy on this and get something awesome. And so speaking of which, does anybody want to see a new preview card? Anybody excited about that? All right, cool. So I mentioned before that there are ways to spend lots of energy all at once and get some pretty awesome things. So I think this is one of them. Let's take a look at what we got here. It's coming.
The suspense.
So this is the Architect of the Untamed, an awesome elf artificer here on Kaladesh. And Architect of the Untamed says whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you get an energy, and you can pay 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 energy all at once to get a 6/6 colorless beast artifact token. And what's super cool about this card is it provides a steady stream of energy, for itself or for any of your energy cards that you can use for doing something pretty simple, just playing a land, right? Every deck does that. This can really go in any deck. But if you have other ways to generate a bunch of energy, then you can kind of funnel it all into this and just produce, 1 or more 6/6 awesome artifact creature tokens. So pretty cool card, and I'm excited to see you all try it out.
All right. So energy is kind of the high concept thing that Mark's been keeping in his back pocket, whereas vehicles is something that I think all of us that design Magic cards had hoped to one day be able to do. Fans have been asking us about it. They fit into fantasy, that there's all these things that we know exist and we want to try to make cards for, and it was a unique puzzle that we had to solve here for Kaladesh. Sean.
So here's a card you might have seen this morning. This is Oval Chase Dragster, and this is a pretty typical way that a vehicle here works. It's not a creature, but you'll notice that it has power and toughness, And in order to get access to it to attack and block like a creature, you need to crew it, which requires tapping a number of creatures equal to whatever its crew number is. It's not always 1, but it's typically pretty low. And I should point out that if you were to cast this, normally you couldn't attack with a vehicle the first turn that it came out, unless it has haste like the Dragster here. But creatures that have newly been summoned, even though they have summoning sickness, can crew a vehicle. So there's an interesting dynamic sometimes where you're hoping to top deck the driver to get in the car and take off.
Okay, so let's talk about where this came from. So Magic Origins, as we said, we gave a little preview of the world, and we didn't know exactly what we were going to do in Kaladesh when Magic Origins happened. We just wanted to make sure, I mean, you designed it. Talk about like, sort of the pressure on you to sort of set ourselves up without promising too much.
Yeah, it was interesting because we had these great visuals and we knew it was this beautiful artifact world, and we had a little bit of sense of that inventiveness wanting to be there, but we also knew we had to, like, we were showing the tip of the iceberg, and we needed to make sure there was a lot more space to keep exploring.
And so one of the things we did is things like this showed up in Origins, and players have been asking for vehicles for almost as long as I can remember. I mean, one of my jobs is I talk to the public. People tell me what they want. I write it all down, and vehicles just kept coming up again and again and again. And to be honest, we kind of avoided them because equipment exists, and we didn't quite know how to handle it, and so we really kind of avoided vehicles. It kept coming up, and we're like, well, this isn't the right world for it. And I felt like finally, I'm like, well, it's hard to, if people want vehicles, it's hard to argue this is not the world for vehicles. And so in exploratory design, I said to the team, I said, okay, guys, let's see if we can figure out how vehicles work. Some more of Sean's pretty writing.
Again, never expected these to be public. So the very first attempt we had for vehicles were kind of these cards on either end here, and they worked kind of like equipment in reverse. You would play creatures, and then you would spend their board cost, kind of like an equip cost, just 4 mana, and you would attach the creature to the vehicle. It would get some sort of bonus, and that had some big problems. Visually, it was hard to represent a bunch of creatures attached to one vehicle, and there were just weird things, like one creature in your hot air balloon could attack while the other sat back to block, and we really didn't like that dynamic.
Yeah, I mean, one of the interesting things we started with is the idea of we were trying to do something really different from equipment. Like equipment exists, so like we didn't want vehicles to just be equipment. We have equipment. So the first idea that Sean was explaining was, we're like, well, let's be very broad, that as many people can get in the vehicles they want, and there's a bonus for being in a vehicle. But what we found time and time again was it had to make sense. When you're trying to do a new mechanic and you just get play situations time and time again, we're like, what's going on? I used to say this all the time. Like, someone would attack, right, you'd be in the hot air balloon and one guy attacks and one doesn't, and I'm like, where's the hot air balloon? Like, what does that mean? And then we like, well, does attacking mean the guy that's not in has to get out of it? And like, it just got really messy real fast. So we nixed that one.
Yeah, it's a bad sign when your mechanic, you start layering on more mechanics to make it make sense, and yeah. So eventually this war balloon in the middle got us on the path to the final version, or the version we were playing in design, where board was still a cost here that you were paying, but now your creature was lending power to the vehicle. So the war balloon on its own was this kind of 0/3. I don't remember if it functioned like a creature or not. It's been so long, but as you put in your Runeclaw Bear, suddenly it becomes a 2/3, and now it can attack and block. And that had a lot of the feel that we really wanted, where now it could mix it up in combat, and it was fun to have your war balloon go up against a drake or a dragon, and that got us on the right path.
Yeah, we're giving an abbreviated version of this. This is the one mechanic that we had like 15 versions of. We tried a lot of different things. But the one that when we handed over from design to development that we liked the most, this is a sample of our board trying to make vehicles. Board meant, crew was called board back then. What it meant was, it was the number of creatures. So if you had a board cost of 2, that meant you had to tap 2 creatures to do it. And there were a whole bunch of decisions we had to figure out, like Was it always a creature that couldn't attack or block until it was crewed? Or was it not a creature? And there was a lot of different things we were trying to figure out. So we went, well, part of the story is we didn't figure it out completely in design. This is what we handed off.
Let me jump in here for 1 sec. You'll notice a lot of cards that didn't survive design. However, Blisteringly Fast Fire Car, that's a straight line to Oval Dragster.
The Death Star is only a 6/6. Really?
Less
Ice
tough than
cream
an
truck
ice cream
didn't
truck.
make it. Okay, so let's. So Ben, like I said, when we talk, Ben was the go-between. So talk a little bit about trying to turn vehicles into something you could actually develop.
So that was challenging. As you can see, we nerfed the Blisteringly Fast Fire Car up there to 4 mana. And I think at this time, all the vehicles even had haste. That was one thing we went back and forth on. And one of the challenges we had was because vehicles have such real-world meaning, at every step of the process, we were evaluating what do people expect these vehicles to do versus how the mechanic works, what it does. You don't have as much of that same thing if you have a more abstract mechanic, but vehicles were so real world, they were so resonant that we did end up asking those questions a lot.
Yeah, real quick. One of the things that we did in this, that we did a lot of top-down design that you can kind of see here. We're like, what does a tank act like? We did a lot of that, much more so than some other stuff.
And there were also a lot of questions like, to give an example, Ben was talking about, what happens if your creature boards your vehicle and your vehicle attacks, and then I cast murder on the creature that's driving the vehicle? Does the vehicle just like suddenly stop and become inert? What if I cast murder on the car? How does that work? What's the flavor behind? Can I get a flavor judge, please? So a lot of questions like that.
Yeah, so what we ended up with was this mechanic and a lot of questions and a lot of goals. Some of the goals being more obvious. We knew we wanted creatures to drive vehicles. We knew we wanted to have that link between the two of them. We knew we wanted them to be different from equipment. And one of the big ways that we did that was moving away from mana as a cost to board the creatures or sort of combine the creatures and the vehicles to make it feel very different. And then also we knew that as we're going into this new card type space, there's always challenges. We wanted these cards to show up in limited and constructed and in different formats. And so early on, before we get too far in the process, we're trying to make some proof of concept cards, some sample cards to show that that really is possible. And sort of all of the decisions we made to move towards a goal or answer a question, whether we were using mana or not, whether the vehicles were creatures all the time, or whether they sat there as artifacts and turned into creatures. When can you activate a vehicle? Is it at instant speed? Is it only when you're attacking? Does it stay a vehicle until your next turn? As Ian mentioned, what happens if the creature dies? What happens if the vehicle dies? Does the creature die? Does the creature's power go to the vehicle? So we tried tons of different things, and just
These
sort
are
of
the hard questions that we wrestle with every day.
we honestly probably tried more than 15 different variations on the vehicle mechanic throughout the process, because there's so many, do we go this way or that way with any individual part of it, and then every playtest theirs, was it fun, but also does it feel like a vehicle?
When I said 15, I don't mean variations of it. I meant we tried lots of different versions of ways vehicles could possibly work, and then within the version we chose, there were 20 plus variations within that version.
Yeah. So yeah, at every stage of the process, we are doing that proof of concepting, and that was very much my role on the team of, okay, now the creatures give it their power, and they always have haste. The creatures can't board this turn. If the creature dies, the vehicle isn't a creature anymore, and when you activate it, it stays until your turn again. Okay, try to make a limited card, a constructed card, and some cards from some other formats to see if we can move forward on this. But it was a really fun mechanic to work on because it did have that real world resonance, and we were seeing people just feel more and more like these were vehicles and get happier and happier as we iterated and played through things. And as with energy, I mean, as we went into the formal development process, there were more questions and more things we had to solve and things to consider, and Ian can talk to you more about that.
So coming out of design, the version of vehicles that were handed off to development, they were non-creature artifacts, baseline. They weren't a creature unless they were crewed. And they had a mechanic now called crew. We called it board at the time, and it had a board number. And the number was the number of creatures that you needed to board the vehicle. So it didn't matter how big they were, it was just kind of going wide. You needed a bunch of creatures to board your vehicle, and sort of the more awesome the vehicle was, the more pilots it took to drive it, which was pretty cool. And it was actually, played pretty well in limited. And in fact, Ben talked about a lot of different versions we tried. We were getting a lot of different versions to play really well in limited. But the concern we had is when we started kind of prototyping constructed decks. Constructed Magic tends to be a little bit more streamlined than limited Magic. When you're building your own deck and choosing what cards you get to play with, the games are faster. There's more pressure to do a lot with each of your turns. And what we were finding is that vehicles weren't really playing well except in decks that made a whole bunch of token creatures because you needed a bunch of creatures to board them. And then there were also a lot of feel-bad moments, like if your opponent cast a card like Wrath of God that killed all your creatures, you'd be left with this vehicle with crew 3, and you're like, wow, I really got my work cut out for me. I got to play one creature at a time until I have 3 before I can use this vehicle again. And so we weren't really able to get that to work in a variety of different decks. They would work in the token decks, but they wouldn't work in your average constructed Magic deck. And we knew this was a mechanic that players were asking for a long time. We really wanted to deliver on it, and we wanted these vehicles to go in a variety of different decks. But we were really getting stuck there. And I spent a lot of time working on this and working with my team and talking to people around the pit, which is our office environment here in R&D, just having conversations and trying to figure things out. And I just kind of got stuck until one day I was chatting with Mark, and we actually got some inspiration from a mechanic we were working on for a future set. And by inspiration, I mean I outright robbed the future set of its mechanics. So Mark is going to tell you about that.
Okay, flash forward to Ham. So what happened was, the way this design works is Sean and I sort of oversaw it. I did the first 6 months, Sean did the second 6 months. We were both there the whole time, but I had to hand over the reins to Sean because I was working on Barrel. And then I handed the reins of Barrel over to Ethan because I was working on Ham, which is next year's fall set. So I was working on Ham.
That's a code name, by the way.
That's a code name, not the real. Ham, it's meaty. So basically what was going on was I had a mechanic that was too close to vehicles. So we were trying to come up with a way to distance it from vehicles. So we said, well, instead of caring about how many creatures you have, what if we care about creatures' power? So we made this whole mechanic to sort of try to get into a different space, to stay away from vehicles. And as we were playing with it, it was playing really fun. Now, in the pit, I actually sit very close to Ian. So I'm right across from Eric Lauer, who's the head developer, and right next to Eric is Ian. So I would hear, we would check in, and I would hear Ian talk about this, and I knew they were having a problem. So I volunteered, I said, okay, we have a mechanic in Ham, which is a year away, that might make sense here. And so I offered it up as a suggestion of, instead of crew being number of creatures, what if it was the power of the creatures being tapped? And what was your first thought, Ethan?
So I was a little skeptical at first. I was like, I'm still not sure. Like, you still need possibly multiple creatures to do this. I don't know, but yeah, I guess we'll try it out, Mark. So we did some work in the file, and we revised all the cards and updated them to use this new version of Crew, which is ultimately the mechanic we ended up going with. And once we played with it, it actually played great. It was fantastic. What it did is it lets you use either a combination of a bunch of small token creatures to crew your vehicle, or you can use one larger, real Magic creature that you actually spent a card on to crew it. And so we were finding it just gave you so much more flexibility. If you're playing like a red-green beatdown deck and you played a 3-power creature, now you could use that to crew your crew 3 vehicle instead of having to have 3 different creatures. And it still worked well in the tokens deck because you were producing a lot of power there. So we just found that it really fleshed things out and made these vehicles work in a variety of different decks, and we definitely hope to see them showing up in a variety of different decks, both in limited play and in constructed play.
In a year from now, I'm going to talk about Ham, the set that everybody stole mechanics from. Because Conspiracy also stole mechanics, so Ham was very generous in its giving out mechanics to sets that came earlier.
So thank you, Ham. So anyway, the last thing we were thinking about with this was we wanted to make sure, again, that the cards were readable, that they worked visually, and that players were able to understand them in the gameplay, both in terms of parsing the card and understanding the text, but also just in-game being able to correctly recognize them as game objects. And what I mean by that is, since these are not creatures unless they're crewed, some players were like leaving them in their, kind of in their land row or off to the side or not kind of up front with their creatures. It was difficult to tell, whether they were activated as creatures or not. And when you're planning attacks and blocks, we wanted to make sure that you're able to parse what the board state is. So we put a lot of effort into making sure that these cards visually looked similar enough to creatures, and you could get, kind of the right information, the power and toughness from them, but that they also had a look onto their own so that they felt separate, they felt like vehicles, and they felt like something new. And so Liz is going to talk more about kind of what she worked on there.
This card was previewed last panel, by the way. We're showing just examples of sort of the frame so you guys can see it, because we're about to talk all about the frame.
Oh, yeah. But this card is sweet, so you guys can feel free to ooh and ah if you haven't seen it before.
Yeah, so there were 2 challenges to meet when designing the frames for the vehicle cards. One, I think, was a flavor challenge, and the other was a mechanical challenge. The flavor challenge, was just making a really sweet border for the cards that would separate them from the other creatures on the battlefield. And when creating a new border for the cards, Magic sort of has all of the colors covered, so we were thinking, what's a good color to focus on for this border? And Jeremy mentioned, artifacts used to be brown. Maybe we can pull from that and use some of the old-fashioned design and bring it in and give it new use. So I've experimented with some wood textures to start with, and eventually added some rivets, and really, in general, one, it just sort of had to look cool. It had to look like an artifact. And I think the other thing that I thought it had to look like was something that was constructed or built by humans or creatures, because that's what vehicles are to me, is they're not natural occurring things. And because we didn't want to tie this frame to Kaladesh explicitly, I wanted to make sure that there was a color scheme or a frame that looked good, as you can see with some of these vehicle-looking type cards, as well as art that we had from Origins that we knew was going to represent what vehicles were going to look like in Kaladesh.
And to clarify, for anyone who's wondering, the art here is just a placeholder to show the frames. We're not reprinting like vehicle hangerback walker or Geist Catcher's rig or whatever these artworks are from.
Yes. Yeah.
Ram roller, yeah.
I basically just pull art from old sets to test in the frames to make sure that they look good. And the next part of the challenge of the frames was how to deal with a conditional power toughness. And we tried a couple things like printing and sort of embossing the power toughness in the text box, which didn't work really well because from across the table you couldn't read it, and I think that's quite important. And finally, we settled on something that you'll notice is really similar to the backside of a double-faced card, which in a way to me sort of feels a little bit like this conditional thing that's been met. When you flip over a card, now you get this new power toughness. And so we printed the power toughness in white on a wood metallic texture to show that it was conditional, and you can't see that here. So
well, you can't see it here, but I have a way maybe we can look at it. Would you guys like to see a preview card for vehicles? So we've shown you a lot of higher rarity vehicles. So I'm going to show you guys a common vehicle, because it's a lot of times you see things that they're super splashy and giant, but sometimes you just want to see the basics. So here's a basic common vehicle.
So vehicles have a bunch of fun design space that you get to play around with. We have this main mechanic of crewing them in order to turn them into creatures, but that basic mechanic also can be applied a little bit differently. So I have another preview card for you here, an uncommon. And this...
Do-do-do!
This is super fun. All those little 1/1s that you were going to put in your cars suddenly get to attack alongside them. We also, as
one of the things that we wanted, I talked about this with Energy earlier, is we wanted you to be able to play a deck full of vehicles, and this card is the kind of card that you can do that with, but we also wanted you to play like one vehicle, and so we wanted to make sure we had cards that do both kinds of things.
So another fun aspect of vehicles, that they're such a part of this world that there are also the drivers. So we have an all-new creature type here. If you want to show one more preview card. There's a variety of pilots that will get in your cars and make them faster or stronger or more powerful in some way.
All right, before we move on to Fabricate, I'm going to answer the question I know you're all asking, which is yes, you can use one vehicle to pilot another vehicle. So you can put your 1-1 in your Oval Chase Dragster and then use your Dragster, once it's a creature, to power up the consulate skyship. So, drive the car onto the skyship, and it's all good. All right.
We did talk about whether or not to allow that or not to allow it,
Yeah.
but it required adding a lot of words to stop it, and we're like,
And taking away awesomeness.
Yeah, it was awesome.
That would be no fun.
And honestly, it's something we played with a lot. Like, doesn't come up that often. Yeah, it does come up sometimes, and you can do it. But like, we also, we play a game where Birds of Paradise can carry Sword of War and Peace, and Fireball can kill fire elementals. So yes, if you go out of your way, you can construct flavor fail scenarios. But that's part of Magic, and ultimately, we thought the mechanic played a lot simpler, read a lot simpler, and was more awesome without those words there. So.
All right, so Fabricate's the last keyword. The first two, super difficult, super crazy out of the box things. Fabricate's a little more workhorsey, a little more easier to execute on. Sean.
So this is a common Fabricate creature, and it's a pretty typical example. When it enters the battlefield, you get this choice. This is leading to that same variance of gameplay that we've talked about so much. And you get the choice between either some number of +1/+1 counters or some number of 1/1 servo artifact creature tokens. And this, it's always giving you that same opportunity. Some of the time they'll have keywords or things to lean you a little bit one way or the other, but it's a pretty straightforward mechanic.
Okay, so let's talk about how this came to be. Okay, so basically what happened was I talked about how we wanted artifacts to be technology. We wanted this to be a world of technology. So we were looking for ways to represent technology. +1/+1 counters worked really well. How do I show that a creature has a device or a gadget that makes them stronger? Well, +1/+1 counters worked. Also, it's a world of artifice. We knew you would expect thopters and things, so we knew we wanted artifact creatures. So we had a lot of themes that connected +1/+1 counters, and a lot of themes that connected artifacts and creatures, but they really were too separate, and we were trying to bridge them. How do we bring them together? And this mechanic literally said, how do we make +1/+1 counters matter in the same decks that care about artifacts or creatures? And so, we just literally bridged the gap. That's how the mechanic came about, is like, the challenge was, we need to make +1/+1 counters and tokens matter in the same deck. And that, it's sometimes you have grandiose ideas, and sometimes it's just like plug A to B. And Fabricate was very plug A to B.
This is more whiteboards from our various meetings where we are plotting out the first attempt at all the various combinations of them. And at least one of them, again, survived.
Okay, so
as Mark mentioned, variants of gameplay and showing these creatures that are augmenting themselves or building things. Fabricate does a ton of good things for all the goals of the set. It also really acts as a glue that ties a lot of the set together. We wanted to make those +1/+1 counters matter, make those enhancements and invention matter, and it gives you that. Back when vehicles were counting number of creatures, it solved problems really well there because it let individual creatures produce multiple bodies to crew vehicles. But then even when we changed the vehicle mechanic to check for power, it actually still works really nicely with vehicles, because when you're trying to get to these exact power thresholds, being able to choose between a 2/1 and a 1/1 or a 3/2 can let you just hit the numbers exactly, leave a creature untapped, or board with one creature, or board two vehicles, which still does come up. So it still worked with vehicles very nicely. And then last, we knew we wanted artifacts to matter, both because of the setting, but also artifacts are challenging to develop. They're colorless. If they're powerful and they matter, any deck can play them. And that was very counter to the goals of the set of having all of this variety and variance. And one way to bridge that is have the artifacts be powerful, but also have other cards that want you to have artifacts that make up the rest of that power. So you're ending up with decks that play lots of different artifacts going in different decks because of which artifact matters cards they have. And if you want to get that to work at lower rarity, you need a lot of artifacts floating around, and Fabricate also really helps with that. So just all of the elements of the set that we wanted to enhance and make come through, Fabricate just helps each one of them really nicely, as well as working with the flavor and the rest of the set really well. And it's got some other interesting things going on that I'll pass off to Ian.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, Fabricate was kind of like the glue that holds the set together in many ways, and it just plays fantastically, especially in limited play. You know, kind of unifies the +1/+1 counters, works well with artifacts mattering, and also works really well with vehicles too. And one of the things we focused a lot on in developing these Fabricate cards is making sure that there were really interesting choices that would vary from game to game depending on the game state. Because again, we want you to feel like you are in control of the choices that you make here, and that you're making dynamic choices depending on what you think is important in the game that you're playing.
We got about 2 minutes, Ian. So
we gave you a lot of incentives to choose one or the other. So cards that care about artifacts, you might want to get a servo token. If you have a vehicle, and you need a little bit more power, you might want to put a +1/+1 counter. And also we gave you some cards that care about +1/+1 counters in limited, so there's a deck to be had there as well. And so we're going to round things off, I think, with a couple more preview cards, which I'm sure you all want to see. Yeah. So we'll take a look at what we have next here.
So coming up, we have another common Fabricate card, so you can see how it'll play out in limited. 3 mana 2/2 that can be a 3/3 or a 2/2 and a 1/1. As I mentioned, this card's really great with vehicles. There is a lot of Crew 1 and Crew 2 floating around. There's also Crew 3, so this card individually can just sort of hit all of those numbers really well and make vehicles work just very nicely in any deck that has a few copies of this.
And check out that amazing mustache.
Yeah, dwarves are back. Woo!
Also, another question that I know will come up is, so Ian, why aren't they Thopters?
Yeah, that's a great question. So that's part of that is, well, Fabricate started off with making 1/1 servo tokens, and the reason we didn't go to Thopters on that is because the difference between a +1/+1 counter on a creature and a 1/1 flying token was just too large. We couldn't make that an interesting choice in many cases. And also, we knew players loved Thopters, so we put lots of Thopters in the set, and we made sure that the Thopter making cards just made Thopters, right? Because you guys just want to make Thopters, so why make it a choice, right? We'll just give you more Thopters. So I think that segues into our next preview card.
Yeah, speaking of making Thopters.
Holy the Hive, Batman.
Yeah, the Hive is crying somewhere. 3 mana, 4 mana, make Thopters, just embracing the idea of invention and making things, and as Ian mentioned, Thopters.
All right, that's it, folks. Coming up in a bit, we'll have day 2 of Worlds. They'll be drafting and playing the Eldritch Moon limited format for 3 rounds. If you want more of design talk, Mark has his Drive to Work podcast. It's going to be over in the other theater, along with Ben and a couple other designers, Sam Stoddard and Gavin Verhey. Big round of applause for these guys. Thanks so much. And enjoy the rest of PAX.